Hello, everyone, and welcome. You are in the right place to learn today about email deliverability. My name is Lawrence Grodeska. I am here to be your host for our webinar, When Good Emails Get Blocked, Deliverability in Your List. We're really excited. We have a great list of attendees, hundreds of organizations, actually nearly 600 staff from nonprofits, from consultancies, from platform providers are on the call with you today to learn about how email deliverability works in this day and age and how you can improve the deliverability of the emails that you send every day. We have a great agenda lined up today. We are in the middle of introductions, and I have my wonderful colleague Alice on the line, who I'll introduce in a minute. But we're going to be talking about a little bit about the email landscape, how email is changing, how it's always been changing, and what it's like today. And we're going to get into some details about why good emails get blocked, which is really, I think, why you're all here today. And we're going to also talk about some key reputation metrics that you should be thinking about when you're thinking about deliverability. And finally, some thoughts on monitoring deliverability over time. We'll have plenty of time for questions and answers at the end. In the browser window that you're watching this webinar through, there is a chat window on the left-hand side. We'd love to hear any questions you have throughout the webinar. We will have plenty of time for you to ask questions directly of Alice about your deliverability problems or issues or successes. And we're also live tweeting this webinar with the hashtag #SpamNoMore. Hopefully this is an objective for all of us to shoot for and visualize that as we share any gleanings we have from Alice on Twitter with that hashtag, #SpamNoMore. We will be recording this webinar and sharing the video via YouTube afterwards, along with some follow-up resources. So happy to have you here. Thanks for joining us. And with no further ado, I'd like to introduce my wonderful colleague, Alice Cornell. Alice is the Director of Email Deliverability at Change.org, and she's been working in the electronic messaging space for quite a long time, about 15 years altogether. Before joining Change.org, she was at ReturnPath, one of the leaders in deliverability and email sending. And so Alice, pleasure to have you here with us today.
Thanks, Lawrence. Really glad to be here.
And where are you calling us from?
I am in London today.
Wonderful. Well, thank you for making the time. I know it's a little late where you are, but really a pleasure to have you here. As I mentioned, my name is Lawrence Grodeska. I'm the Director of Nonprofit Community at Change.org, and it's my job to share our expertise at Change.org in online advocacy and fundraising with all of you to make sure that you're connecting with the right networks of new supporters to be effective with your work. And that's really what we do at Change.org. We are the world's platform for change. We empower people everywhere to create the change that they want to see. That's our mission. And at this point, over 75 million people around the world have taken action on Change.org by signing a petition about a cause they care about. We see the impact of these passionate folks every day, and it's incredible to see the victories that are happening. At this point, since we've been tracking over 7,000 victories and counting. And that collective impact is just a true inspiration for us here at Change.org and underpins everything we do every day. So we're really excited to be sharing our expertise with all of you. We send a lot of email at Change.org. Alice tells me that we're over 240 million emails a month. Is that right, Alice?
That is correct.
So that's a lot of email. We've learned a lot in the process. We've had some failures. We've had some successes. So that's what we're going to be talking about. And really, email is always changing. It's a never-ending process of fighting spam that the major inbox providers are waging. So it's important to stay on top of what's happening, what's current, and Alice is our expert on Change.org staff to help us make sure we're getting emails to the inbox. Before we dive into the current email landscape, we'd love to hear a little bit from all of you about how you use email at your organization. This will allow us to tailor our content a little bit, and also just very interesting to see how organizations leverage email today. It's really one of the key channels we have, and so if you wouldn't mind sharing a little bit, choose more than one. I'm sure many of you are using all five, if not other ways that you're using email. And let's see, just give it another moment here as the responses tally in. It looks like newsletter is in the lead at the moment, followed by fundraising. Fundraising is catching up to newsletter. Let's skip to the results so you can check that out. Yeah, so advocacy actually is the highest with 83%. Well, that's great. It's really helpful for us to know how you're using email because today, with the sort of advent and of the digital age and being firmly entrenched in the new web world over the last decade or so, email has become the most important tool for most organizations. It's a Swiss Army knife of sorts. This Swiss Army knife is a little over the top, but is indicative of all the things that we can use email for. And at change.org, as I mentioned, we send a lot of email, but we also work closely with organizations like you, our clients that are using email for advocacy, for fundraising, for volunteer engagement. So those are some of the lessons we want to be sharing with you today. Some numbers about the nonprofit email landscape. List size has continually grown over the past few years. Since 2013, list size has grown 14% for nonprofits. These are from the latest M&R nonprofit benchmarks. But while list size has grown, open rates and click-through rates have declined. In particular, advocacy click-through rates are down 17% from 2012. So really what this shows us is that even though list sizes are growing, engagement is down. And what we like to say sometimes is list size is a vanity metric. It's important to continually grow your list, but it's more important to be growing your list with active and engaged users. And that's a lot of what Alice is going to be sharing with us, is how to focus on engagement as the most important metric rather than list size. So Alice, why don't you tell us a little bit about what's happening on the email service provider and inbox provider landscape that's been challenging for deliverability lately?
Sure thing. So yes, you're absolutely right. List size isn't everything, and it's quality over quantity that counts. And so what's been happening in the email world recently? So mailbox providers such as Gmail and Hotmail seem to be drowning under a tide of spam. There's so much spam being sent, and it's their job to try and find the good mail amongst the bad. And I should just say at this point that I'm going to refer to Hotmail as Hotmail throughout this presentation, even though they have technically rebranded as Outlook.com. But just to prevent any confusion, I'm going to call them Hotmail, and I apologize. So trillions of spam messages are sent every day, and they're trying to find the good mail from the bad. And more mailbox providers are starting to use engagement as a metric to determine that good mail. So they're monitoring response to organizations' messages and treating them differentially based on individual and overall list performance, so how people are responding to your messages. And the algorithms that they use to do this are constantly changing to try and prevent spam from reaching the users. And in a moment, we're going to have a look at some of the key metrics involved in that. So recently, the impact of sender reputation on email delivery has been increased even further through the launch of the new smart inbox features. Gmail's priority inbox, which measures how users interact with emails from different senders and then decides whether or not those emails should be considered as priority, is really a notable example. Typically, emails from friends and colleagues are flagged as priority mails and appear at the top of the inbox and everything else below. But Gmail's also introduced the new tabbed inbox, which automatically classifies the mail a user receives. And of course, the other ISPs, such as Hotmail, Yahoo, AOL, have also rolled out similar inbox placement prioritization techniques. And they reward trusted sender status and or positive engagement behavior. So I talk a lot about deliverability. I sometimes can't pronounce it, but I talk a lot about it. And what exactly do I mean by that? Well, deliverability is the art of reaching the inbox. And that sounds simple, doesn't it? If you send an email, it arrives. But unfortunately, it's becoming harder and harder to stay ahead of the spammers and ensure that your mail delivers to that inbox. So for the mailbox providers, such as Hotmail, Gmail, etc., knowing that if their users receive too much spam, they're just going to move service provider, it's super important to ensure that they only deliver the mail their users want. So delivering our mail isn't a priority for them at all, whereas keeping their users happy really is.
Excellent. Thank you, Alice. So let's jump into the start of really I think what's going to be most interesting for folks on this call is why emails get blocked. We've seen a little bit about what's happening at inbox service providers that prevents email from getting into the inboxes that you're trying to reach. But how can we avoid these obstacles in the future? Alice, what are some of the factors that impact deliverability?
Sure. So this is a question I'm often asked. Why my emails are good? I'm a good sender. Why are they being blocked? So we touched on reputation earlier. And what I mean by sender reputation is how mailbox providers view us and our programs based on our actual sending behavior and also on how our recipients respond to our mails. So mailbox providers use reputation as a differentiating factor between good mail and spam. And with such a massive amount of spam being sent, they need all the help they can get. So it used to be that content was the key driver for mail being filtered to the spam folder, such as using the word free or lots of exclamation marks. But this is no longer always true. And a recent study by Return Path found that 77% of the time, it's actually reputation that determines inbox placement. So content is still important, but not nearly as much. And now much more in terms of how users respond to it than of actual content filters being triggered. So in fact, senders with good reputation can pretty much include whatever content they like in their mails, and it's usually only senders with poor reputation that get filtered due to content. So what can we do? Well, unfortunately, the rules of the deliverability road aren't always clear. In fact, each mailbox provider has different thresholds for the key metrics that are used to determine reputation and therefore inbox placement. And so what might be true at Hotmail may not be true at Yahoo or at Comcast. And this, of course, is a particular challenge for any global organization, especially as many mailbox providers are reluctant to share this kind of information to prevent spammers from gaining the system, which they, of course, are keen to do.
So Alice, if every email inbox provider has different rules, that's pretty challenging to stay on top of. Are there resources out there that organizations can rely on to find out about different reputation rules for different inbox providers?
Sure, there are resources. There's no one-stop shop, unfortunately, but don't worry, I'll cover them in some later slides and share them in the follow-up material afterwards also.
Great, thank you. And yeah, just a reminder to folks, we will be following up not only with this video, but also some resources that you can use to follow up on some of the topics that Alice is sharing. So to dive into reputation metrics, if sender reputation is the most important thing that governs inbox placement, then let's learn a little bit about some of the metrics that impact sender reputation. Alice has 6 main factors that we're going to be reviewing, but some of these are dependent on the email configuration and infrastructure that you have. So what we'd like to do is ask another poll, and this in particular will influence some of the details that Alice shares. Do you have a dedicated IP for your email services or a shared ISP, or shared IP? A dedicated IP would be an IP address that is unique to your email program, probably provided through a higher-end email service provider. If you are on a platform like MailChimp or Vertical Response, it's probably a shared IP. If you're not quite sure, that's fine. Just let us know. But it looks like the majority of people are not quite sure, and the rest are split kind of down the middle between dedicated IP and a shared IP. I love watching the numbers come in because I feel like I'm at the races and seeing which car is going to win or which runner. And so the results right now, didn't mean to do that. The results right now are, so pretty much split between dedicated IP and shared IP and not quite sure. So thanks for that. Alice, why don't you get us started on the 6 key reputation metrics?
Sure thing. So the first metric is really, the first thing is to get your infrastructure set up correctly. Getting the basics right, it's really important to have a good foundation for your program. And if you're using an ESP, an email service provider, then they've probably got all that covered for you. But for those of you using your own IP or sending in-house, you probably know that there's some things you need to cover. So key elements are things like you must have a working unsubscribe in every message. implementing authentication, and authentication, I would say definitely SPF and DKIM, and I can provide more information on those for all your mail streams. And this is essentially proving that you're a real and bona fide sender who you say you are. Feedback loops is another key element of infrastructure, and that's how we handle user complaints that come in via ISPs like Hotmail or Gmail. And I'll come back to these in a moment. So it's great to have dedicated IPs where possible. That's because you then can't be affected by somebody else's reputation that you're sharing the IP with. However, if you're using a shared IP, most email service providers take great pains to ensure they don't have bad apples on their shared IPs, so I don't think that should be too much of a problem for you, and it's absolutely no problem to be using shared IPs in the least. Something else that you might want to consider is your connection and throughput speeds, so how many messages you're delivering to each of the ISPs, because they have different thresholds, and that can be important, especially if you're delivering into Europe or globally. And finally, I would say bounce processing, which is managing the invalid addresses in your database. These are the basics of infrastructure that it's good to have covered. And as I say, most ESPs will be handling that for you. But one more thing to note is about IP permanence. And that's about building up a sender reputation on your IP or IPs, and more actually building up a reputation on your sender domain. If you change IPs, you're definitely going to need to warm up the new ones by increasing volume on them slowly and steadily, no nasty surprises. And if you should damage the reputation of your IP by sending something in error, then you're much better to stay with the IP and fix the reputation there, rather than swapping from IP to IP, as that's viewed as very spammy behavior by mailbox providers. Number 3 is all about complaints. And complaints are the most important factor in determining reputation. If subscribers are hitting the "This is spam" button and complaining about our mail, then ISPs are going to have to react. And they're going to react by filtering or even blocking our mail to protect their users. So when I say filtering, I mean that the mail is going to go to the spam folder rather than the inbox. So there's a few different ways that a subscriber can complain, but mostly it's by hitting the spam button. They might also send a complaint to a filtering application or a blacklist, or directly to a postmaster or administrator. But that's what I mean by complaints. So how can we reduce those? Well, firstly, by removing complainers from our database via the feedback loops offered by the major mailbox providers. So someone hits the "This is spam" button at Hotmail. If you have joined the feedback loop program, they will send that address back to the sender so that they can be removed and that person won't be bothered any longer. That's the first thing. And then after that, really good user experience is so important. So setting expectations so that people know why they're receiving mail from you. And of course, there's mailing frequency, not too few, not too many. And as with all things email, this really needs to be tested to see what will work best for your program, because most programs are very different. Clear, consistent branding will build trust with your subscribers. They'll trust that the mail comes from you. And finally, I would say making sure that your unsubscribe is clear and easy to use. It's much better for unengaged users to unsubscribe than for them to complain, as this damages our reputation. And by the way, putting your unsubscribe link at the top of the page can be a really quick fix for complaint reduction if you're having problems with those. Here's an example of how a fail in our user flow impacted deliverability. A change to the change.org site meant that the landing page confirming successful unsubscription was replaced with our home page. And so users thought that the unsubscribe wasn't working, and so they hit the spam button. And I saw the impact of this pretty much straight away, particularly at Hotmail. Luckily, we quickly restored the correct pages for each country without doing too much damage to our reputation, but it was really clear to see how the user experience affected our complaint rate.
That's great, Alison. I just want to put in another plea for questions, or just encourage people to be asking questions in the chat window on the left-hand side. I see some are coming in. We'll get to those at the end of the webinar. But if you have any questions, we'd love to hear them. We'll have plenty of time in just a little bit. So thanks, Alice.
Well said, Lawrence. Thank you. So the next factor I want to talk about is data hygiene. A good email program is all about the quality of your data. So keeping your list clean by removing invalid addresses, and that's through the bounce processing I mentioned earlier. And of course, you want it to be full of people who are excited to get your mail and actively opening and clicking on it. There are some warning signs if your data starts to become unhealthy, and one of those key signs is spam traps. Now, there are two types of spam traps. The first one is honeypot, or also known as pristine traps. And these are addresses that have been created and planted on the internet to catch people with poor data collection practices, i.e. the buying and selling of harvested data. So trawling the internet for any address they can find and then selling that data on. Triggering one of these traps can have a really serious impact on deliverability and cause you to be listed at some major blacklists. And that can definitely affect deliverability to the major mailbox providers. Now, there are also what are known as recycle traps. And these are old addresses that have been retired by a mailbox provider and then turned into spam traps to highlight poor data hygiene practices. So they're addresses that have been inactive for a long time. And these don't usually have a major impact on deliverability, but they act as warning signs that you might need to clean your data. And if you see too many of these, then you will start to see your reputation deteriorating. Now, some people waste a lot of time searching for spam trap addresses, but by their very nature, these are created to be addresses that nobody knows what they are, and they change very frequently. So it's much more important to tackle the source of the trap rather than trying to find an actual address on your database. And if you're going to avoid having those traps in your data, the number one rule is never buy data. Renting data is always much more sensible if you need to do that. And make sure you only email your most active users. And that brings me on to the subject of sunsetting. So aged and inactive records are the primary reason that most senders have spam traps in their database. An inactive address can be recycled by an ISP like Hotmail in as little as 9 months. So removing inactive users from your regular database in a timely fashion is a great best practice. The exact timing should definitely be decided by you and based on your own user data. For example, here at Change, we found that a third of our returning users re-engage after a 6 to 9 month period of inactivity. And so clearly we didn't want to stop mailing before then. I would also say that old and unengaged subscribers are much more likely to respond negatively to mail. So it's important to try to continue to engage this segment, but do it carefully so that you don't impact overall deliverability. So as I mentioned, one of the main reasons that sunsetting is so necessary is that engagement is becoming one of the most important metrics of sender reputation. Are recipients opening and clicking your mail? Are they adding your sender address to their address book or safe senders list? Engagement is measured in different ways by different mailbox providers. For example, Hotmail has a panel of trusted users that they ask to vote on whether a mail is spam or not. Yahoo used the ratio between people voting this is not spam and people moving the mail from a spam folder to the inbox, known as this is not spam. So the key question here is whether users are interested in the mail we're sending them. And this is even more important with the advent of priority inbox, the suite functionality that Hotmail introduced, and the Gmail tabbed inbox that I mentioned earlier. And also, filtering due to subscriber engagement can be really dynamic. If people start complaining about our mail, the mailbox provider can choose to filter it to the spam folder. However, if enough people then open and click the mail, or particularly move it from the spam folder to the inbox, then the filtering will switch back to the inbox again. And this can happen multiple times during a single send. So what can we do to improve subscriber engagement? Some key things are set your expectations well, send a great welcome message, get people involved right from the start. Think about targeting and segmenting your database. So personalizing your mails as much as possible, but let the data tell the story, because often we find that sending to our whole list regularly improves overall engagement rather than just focusing on pockets of targeted data. Where appropriate, mix up your content so you're not always saying the same old thing. Try and make your mail really interesting. I sound silly saying it, but as interesting as possible for your users. And you might want to allow your recipients to be in control of what you're sending them as much as possible. You might want to promote your preference center, or perhaps you want to consider letting users manage the frequency of the mail they receive. Something to consider. And be relevant. Ensure that your messages are striking a chord with your subscribers and pique their interest. After all, if no one's opening your mail, then why send it? And finally, you could consider creating a win-back strategy for those less engaged recipients. And that could even be based on user activity or behavior to try and draw people back into your program. I'm going to move on and talk a little bit now about message quality. So as I mentioned way back at the beginning, 17% of filtering is still due to message content, so it's still important. Every message you send promotes your organization, so you want to be sure that you've got clear and consistent branding, and that your email template is well structured, so no stretched images, etc. And make sure it's got good, clean HTML. Spammers cobble together their messages from any old code or content, so make sure that yours looks good. The huge variety of email readers and environments now means it's really important to test every message before sending. So how do your mails render in mobile, for example? Do they look good in Gmail on an iPad as well as in Hotmail on a desktop? And do you even know what the majority of your users are viewing your mail on? Some really important questions. So also remember that some email readers still block images by default. I know that Gmail has them turned on, but a lot still blocks them. So don't rely solely on images to communicate your message. And remember to include alt tags, keeping in mind that some programs for the visually impaired rely on these to communicate the message. And as a final bonus tip, I would say try to avoid using a public bit.ly or other shortener domain, because these can be viewed as innately spammy by mailbox providers. I would use a proprietary shortener domain, so we use ch.nge rather than change, which you can then build a good reputation on. And using that or using a public link can be the difference between landing in the inbox or the spam folder. The other challenge we face, particularly around content, is controversial content. So we're often dealing with challenging subjects. And a great example of a successful campaign with content that we were concerned over is a campaign run recently in the UK about pornography. And this actually delivered to inbox and had a great response, even with what we would expect to be trigger words in the content. And it delivered because our reputation as a sender is good. However, as we've discussed, reputation is dynamic. So I would really recommend, if you have contentious content, you should test it and tweak it if you need to. So we've looked at the 6 major factors, but what are the key takeaways for anybody listening in? So for in-house senders that aren't using an email service provider, I would make sure that you have the key things to have covered are authentication, so SPF and DKIM setup, setting up those feedback loops with the major mailbox providers, so to process the complaints that could be coming back in through them. Very valuable information to be getting if a lot of people are complaining about your messages. Bounce processing is also key, suppressing those invalid addresses. If you have too many on your database, then you'll certainly start to see some spam folder delivery. And also connection and throughput speeds, so making sure that you're delivering the right amount of messages in the right time frame. Even if you're using an ESP, you can probably check with them to make sure that they have these things covered for you, and you might want to get a little bit more information about those things. But for everyone, I would say a key thing, I can't stress it enough, is to have a clear and working unsubscribe that's very straightforward and easy to find. You also need to be making sure that you're adhering to local legislation, CAN-SPAM for the States, CASL, which is the Canadian anti-spam legislation for anyone sending out of or into Canada, the EU legislation, which is going to be changing in the next couple of years, and that there are more internationally and probably more on the way. Another key thing, to retire inactive users from your database, or perhaps just implement a strategy to re-engage them. And finally, my last and most important thing is to test everything, because I can give you all the advice in the world, and best practice is all very well, but you need to find what really works for you and for your particular subscriber base.
Excellent. Thank you, Alice. We have one more section to go about some of the tools that you can use to monitor. Before we move on, I just want to toss some questions, one question in particular that came up to you, Alice, about something you mentioned around segmentation. Both Garth and Carla asked about something you said, just to clarify that full list sends are better for good list reputation or engagement. Was that accurate, the comment you made there?
So you're always going to get a better response and better engagement from targeted mails. But that can mean that if you're only sending to small segments of your data, a large part of your database or some part of your database may not be being reached. And if those people aren't reached for some time, then you probably aren't sending to them frequently enough to keep up their engagement. So even after sending your targeted mails, it's good to send to a rest of list as well, to make sure that you're reaching out to everybody on a regular basis, and also trying to get more, pick up more profile information on them about what they're interested in receiving.
So it sounds like that's an instance where an email calendar would really help to balance out the more targeted, smaller sends with the broader list sends to keep engagement up across the board.
Absolutely.
Great. Well, thank you for those clarifying questions. Some amazing questions have come in. We're going to wrap up this last section about how we monitor deliverability and some tools that are available out there. This is what Alice does every day, so I know that she's excited to talk about a couple of the tools that we use here at Change.org.
Sure thing. So one of the first things I'd say is it's so important to test your mail as if you were receiving it as a subscriber. So I wouldn't do my testing to my Change.org address. I do it to a completely new test address. So how is the mail performing in Gmail or in Hotmail or in AOL, wherever? Did it reach the inbox? Does it look good? Does it render well? There are several companies offering services that either use seed addresses or panel data to help you understand inbox placement and rendering, but you can also create your own test addresses at mailboxes that are relevant to you. So do you know what the majority of your users are receiving your mail on? I would say that here at Change globally, Gmail and Hotmail are neck and neck as the two biggest providers for us. There's an array of free tools that you can use to monitor your reputation. SNDS is one, that's Smart Network Data Services, and that's provided by Microsoft to monitor reputation at Hotmail. Some really great information there about how Hotmail is viewing your traffic, and I use that often as a reference point because I think what our Hotmail users feel is probably going to be reflected by other mailbox providers' users. Also, you could have a look at senderscore.org, mailtester.com, and there's usually postmaster sites for all the major providers. AOL and Yahoo have really great ones, for example, and they're used to monitor sender reputation. There are also sites like multi-RBL Valley, I think, .org, which is a great site to check if you're blacklisted anywhere. And I'll provide links to these in our follow-up, so don't worry about that too much. So these free tools are really useful. I use them every day. We also we use Return Pass to monitor deliverability, but we also use Litmus, and a lot of ESPs provide this kind of information, and it's all good. The more information at your fingertips, the better, in my opinion. Finally, what I wanted to mention was what to do when things go wrong. So we've all done it, or we've all had that horrible experience. You've sent your whole data set in error, or you've sent an incendiary subject line to your sunsetted users, and it's that cold hand on your heart. But don't panic is the main thing. So your reputation will usually repair quickly, but in cases where it doesn't, most major mailbox providers provide a ticketing system where you can ask for advice on what you've been doing wrong, or what you've done wrong, or you can explain your mistake. And usually mailbox providers recognize when a one-off send is a mistake, and you can repair your reputation quickly. But here's an example from change.org. So one of my campaigners sent a mail to 5 million sunsetted users in 2 parts: aged sunsets and recent sunsets. And I tell you, I had kittens that day. The results were pretty uncomfortable, but they were really interesting as well. So the aged sunsets were blocked at Gmail, and Gmail rarely blocked traffic, so I was surprised and horrified. But I expect that was due to very low user engagement. Whereas the recent sunsets were just filtered 100% at Hotmail due to high user complaints, because users in this segment were unengaged, but clearly much more vocal about it than the people that had been unengaged for longer. And so this did have a knock-on effect for all our traffic, but it was resolved within 48 hours. So when something like this happens, some good fix-it tips are to continue to send so that mailbox providers can start to re-establish your good reputation. You might also consider sending to active users only to speed up that process, or possibly reducing your connection and throughput speed so you're not sending so much mail all at once. And I have never come across an IP whose reputation couldn't be fixed. So all is never lost. So we've come to the end of my slides, and we're going to open up the floor to questions.
Great. Thanks, Alice. That was some really incredible and helpful content. I know it was a lot of content for you folks listening. Some questions came in about the list of monitoring tools and other resources. We will be following up. Alice is putting together a list of tools that not only we use, but that are available. Some suggestions have come in about tools that some of you are using, so we'll be sure to include those as well. So that email and the video for the webinar will be going out next week. So hold tight. We'll have those all listed out for you, and we'd love to provide that information. So lots of great questions that came in. First one I think is a simple one to start, but talked a lot about engagement. Alice, what does engagement mean to you? Is it just an open? Is it a click-through? What is important to think about as far as measuring engagement?
It's all those things. It is positive measures of engagement are things like opens and clicks, very much so. People replying to messages can also be seen as positive engagement. Users adding your sender address to their safe sender list or whitelisting your sender address, also positive engagement. Moving mail from the spam folder to the inbox, super positive, and that's some of the best engagement that you can have. So there are many different elements to it, but essentially, if you have a user base that is active and actively interacting with your emails, then that is the best positive engagement you can have. Great.
So we're going to go back a little bit towards the beginning of the webinar. There's a couple questions that came in around complaints. Ian asks, how do we know if we have complaints? And Grant is interested in determining complaint rate. Is there a sharp drop in individual domain opens, or are there other indications? So how do we know, and is there a way to pinpoint where complaints are coming from within our list? Can you talk a bit more about that?
We can, and it's difficult to do unless you have set up these feedback loops with the ISPs, such as Hotmail, Yahoo, Comcast, etc. So when we send out the information after this, I'll definitely list out where you can sign up for these feedback loops. It's free to sign up because the service providers would much rather that you were removing people that were unhappy about receiving mail. So that's possible to do. If you're using an ESP, they should be able to provide your complaint rate to you. Or if you're using monitoring tools such as, I think someone said they were using MailChimp, there's Return Path, there's Litmus, they're also able to provide these complaint rates to you. In my experience, when I see a dip, especially somewhere like Hotmail, I'm pretty sure that we've done something that's caused complaints. Hotmail's very sensitive to user complaints. It's one of their major metrics. So if I see mail struggling there, then I think, what can we have done that could have caused people to complain here?
Great. And then speaking of feedback loops, there's a question about how specifically to set up feedback loops. Do you have any tips or pointers or even resources online about setting up feedback loops with the different ISPs?
I do, and I can add those to the follow-up information.
Great. And I know Alice has been instrumental in helping us get feedback loops set up with our different email programs here at Change.org. So happy to share her resources with you. There are a question from Brett about what he feels is a catch-22, that nonprofits and political campaigns are exempt from CAN spam, but CAN spam doesn't take into account some of what you discussed. Any thoughts about that?
Oh, I do. So CAN spam is really one of the legislations. It's the lowest common denominator, and in the email industry world, we sometimes joke that CAN spam means that you can spam. So CAN spam is a good. You need to be abiding by it. You need to be abiding by the law, and that's true. But it's still possible to be a poor sender and be CAN spam compliant. So the suggestions that I'm making are to make sure that you are one of the best senders, so that your email will deliver to the inbox. Because the recommendations that I'm suggesting will help you reach that goal. Although you may not need to do it under CAN spam. So I hope that answers your question. I think that non-profits and political campaigns are exempt and can be, and I think charities are exempt from the Canadian anti-spam legislation also. But that doesn't mean that we shouldn't abide by best practices and be good senders within our industry.
Yeah, I would imagine that CAN spam regulations are not the only things that inbox providers care about. Then inbox providers are probably more stringent about their management of inbox user experience than CAN spam would dictate. So,
for sure,
great.
Protecting their users is their number one thing. So yeah.
Yeah. So probably best to be as on top of what works for their users and what they've set out as possible, regardless of CAN spam. So there is a question that came up from Graham at Engaging Networks about sunsetting, and there's another question that also came in about sort of timeline for sunsetting. Graham said that some nonprofits like to hang on to records and to continue emailing them, and even those that have stopped engaging with their content. At what stage, length of time since last engagement should nonprofits stop sending to records? And I know you said this should be tested, but any more thoughts about or guidelines about sunsetting timeframes?
Sure. So if I was wearing my super duper best practice hat, I would say 6 months, because if no one's engaging with you after 6 months, then they're probably not interested. However, my own Change.org data proved me wrong and showed that a lot of our users re-engage even after being inactive for up to 9 months. So, as I mentioned, ISPs such as Hotmail can recycle addresses into spam traps after just 9 months. So 9 months is a good cutoff point, but you need to test your data, because you don't want to be losing good users if you have users that are unengaged for longer and yet still coming back to your site. So I can give you a general best practice and say, you could say 9 months to a year, and you can make that decision. But I would really let the data make that decision for you and try and analyze how many of your users return to your site after being inactive for however long.
And speaking of engagement, Laura Shapiro asks about engagement versus list size metric. In particular, how do you convince leadership that engagement matters more than list size, especially when list size has become a reporting metric for donors to demonstrate impact?
Sure, and that is it's always a challenge. The challenge we always come up against. So I find that the proof is often in the pudding. Having an enormous list can sound great, but actually you're wasting money by trying to send to that list. So if you were to remove all the inactive users, you actually lower your costs, and you get more out of the responsive users that you continue to email to, as well as improving your deliverability, getting higher inbox placement, and therefore better response again to your campaigns.
All right. The wonderful questions keep coming in, so we're just going to keep moving on here. So if you have any other questions, please share. A question from Sherry at Volunteer Match. She wants to know how to find out which devices folks are accessing messages through, considering that most ESPs that she's familiar with don't have that info. Is there a way that we know that how people are accessing our email?
There are several third-party tools that you can use. I'm not sure that any of them are free. I will investigate to see if I can find a free tool to share with everybody, but otherwise the usual monitoring companies such as Return Party Litmus can usually provide that information. And some ESPs can also. But I don't think there's a free tool, unfortunately.
Gotcha. Yeah, I've seen that MailChimp is starting to roll out more paid features, really amazing features, but they're obviously trying to monetize their product, and for the basic free level service, offering bump up features at cost. So, but if we can find anything, we'll share it in the follow-up email with you all as far as free tools for figuring out how people are viewing your email messages. There was a question about, interesting question about from Kathleen about how do we know when someone adds us to their safe senders list? Is there a way to be just kind of the opposite of complaints? Is there a way for us to know when someone has marked us as a safe sender?
Some monitoring companies provide that visibility. However, there's no way of knowing otherwise. And I would usually suggest that it's part of the onboarding process. It's where you should suggest that the user adds your sending address to their whitelist or to their safe senders list. So maybe in the first welcome email, why not add this sender address to make sure that you always get our mails and there's never a problem. It's a one line of text, and it's really worth it if people take you up on that. But there's no way of knowing, unless you're using a third-party monitoring tool, as far as I know, how many people do that.
Great. Thanks, Alice. Question, considering your experience not only working for Change.org and all the countries where we're sending email, but also the fact that you live in the United Kingdom, someone from Capital Partners is interested to know of any key observations and guidance for email campaigns in the UK versus the United States.
So the difference between sending in the UK and sending in the States?
Yeah.
The key difference is that in the States you have a smaller amount of mailbox providers. So probably you have 10 main ones, and in the UK we have many, many more. So making sure that your mail renders and if you're trying to check deliverability at all those different mailbox providers, that can be a real challenge. Otherwise, there is difference in legislation. If you're a good sender and you're following best practice, then you should be fine under CAN-SPAM and under the EU legislation until the EU directive comes in, which will be in around 2015, and that will make major changes to the way that we need to send campaigns in Europe, the UK, and yeah. So that's we've got a year to prepare, a year and a half to prepare, I think.
Okay. Let's see. Another question from Garth about asking email providers to keep in touch with ISPs for complaints. Is that something that email providers do to monitor ISP complaints?
Yeah. So ESPs such as SendGrid, MailChimp, they should be able to provide complaint rates for you.
Okay. there's a question from Chad about consistently having problems with Comcast in particular, blocking or graylisting, while we have no problems with other major inbox service providers. Are you aware of any problems with Comcast specifically? I'm sure this changes from month to month, but any insight you can share on that?
That's an interesting one. It might be one that we have to take up offline, but it could be that they're blacklisted, that you're blacklisted at Comcast. So I'll have a few further questions around that, but I'd certainly love to try and help you out with that.
Okay, and there's a kind of a follow-up, more general question that's related to that is how do we find out what our reputation score is for each email platform? Is there a way to go to Comcast and find out if you're blacklisted there? So
through their postmaster site, through most of the major mailbox providers' postmaster sites, you can get a good idea of what your reputation there is like. If you use the SNDS service for Hotmail, AOL Postmaster certainly does it. The Yahoo Postmaster, I haven't looked at the Comcast Postmaster recently, but could do. And you can also look at your overall reputation score by using someone like senderscore.org, and that will let you know how your overall reputation is being viewed by mailbox providers.
Great. So this question is, I'm just going to read it verbatim because I don't think I can summarize it, but it's an interesting one from Sonia. She asks, I've heard a lot about the user unknown email status that indicates that an email does not exist. Do you know anything about it, and can you explain it at all? Yeah, I'll leave it there. It goes on, but maybe just start with that.
I think that what we're talking about here is our bounce codes. So when you send an email, there'll always be a code that will tell you whether that mail has been successful or not. And there's three sorts. So a 250 code is successful, and we don't need to worry about that one because the successful delivery is gone and it's done. But there are two other types of bounce code, which is the messages that come back from the mailbox providers to say that a mail has not been delivered. And they're called soft bounces and hard bounces. So a soft bounce is a temporary problem. So it could be the mailbox is full, for example, and you could retry that email and it will probably go through the next time. But the other kind of bounce is a hard bounce, and that's a permanent bounce. And that will be more like this address does not exist, or this server does not receive messages, or it's a permanent it's a permanent error, which means you shouldn't retry your mail to those addresses. In fact, it's better if you remove those invalid addresses from your database. And that's what I mean by bounce processing. Really important to try and clean your database of addresses that have been keyed incorrectly or have come out of date, or the person has moved on or changed addresses. Clean your data. Good clean data is a really good metric for reputation. Does that answer your question? I hope so.
Yeah. Great. Well, we'll take a couple more questions here. We're getting to the end of the hour, but there is just a great flow of questions. So really appreciate all of your problems and your interest in deliverability. First of all, I just want to say that there's a few folks that said that they have issues with Comcast all the time. Jason says we have issues with Comcast all the time. Erica says everyone has that problem with Comcast. So you're not alone out there. Question from Jason: are corporate email systems generally more restrictive than the likes of Gmail or the bigger inbox service providers?
Yes, they can be, and this is why it's often good if you can use a third-party monitoring tool. If you're using something like Litmus or ReturnPath or any of the email service providers' monitoring tools, you can actually see, most of them do a preview, which means you can check to see how your email will deliver. A lot of different corporate filters, so postfix, Comcast, there's a Ironport, there's a whole list of these server-based filters, and it's really important to make sure that your mail can pass those. So if you're sending a lot of B2B mail or messages into businesses or into corporate addresses, then having some sort of access to monitoring those filters could really work for you. But often you'll find that sending to corporate domains can be trickier because they have much stricter rules about the type of mail that will be delivered. So if it's HTML, if it has a lot of images, if it has God forbid, an attachment, then you may find it more difficult to deliver there.
All right. Well, let's. I want to ask one more question, which I think is this is a really interesting question, especially folks that are maybe calling in from platforms and have different types of emails that go out rather than just action alert type emails. And asks, generally, are autoresponders and other transactional emails treated with the same best practices as broad blast emails?
So should they be, or are they? Well, I would say that are they? Transactional email will always deliver better than broadcast email, let's call it. Gmail specifically says that they don't want to deliver anything but transactional email. And often transactional mail, it's best to keep it separate from broadcast mail because it's sometimes business critical. It's a message that's responding to an action by a user, and it's absolutely crucial that it gets through. So transactional mail will nearly always have a much better reputation than your broadcast mail, which people are much more likely to complain about or to ignore or to respond negatively to. So I like, not all transactional mail technically needs to have an unsubscribe, but I would say that for best practice, I would cover transactional messages with the same best practice that you apply to your broadcast messages as well. Excellent.
Alice, thank you so much for sharing all of your knowledge and expertise and just cranking through a ton of amazing questions there. Really wonderful to have you join us today.
It's an absolute pleasure, and thank you for all those questions. I hope if we didn't get to all of them, we'll try and follow up afterwards, and I will certainly be including as much information as I can in our follow-up messages to you all.
Yeah, so please look for an email follow-up next week with a link to the video for this webinar, so you can go back and review some of the topics that were covered, as well as some resources that we're compiling to speak to some of the topics that Alice discussed. Thank you all so much for joining us. Hope this was valuable. Hope this improves your attempts to reach your supporter inboxes. Stay in touch with us. We're at Twitter/changeorgs. We're at Facebook.com/changeorgs. And my email is lawrence@change.org. If you have any questions, you'd like to follow up at all, please feel free to email me. We'd be happy to hear from you. Thank you. Have a wonderful day or evening, depending on where you're calling from. And we'll see you again online sometime real soon. Take care.